Welcome back to Educator.com. Today's lesson is on objects. So, objects are a pure object-oriented language. What happens is everything in Ruby is an object, as we've gone through in other lessons. All values are objects, and there's no distinction between primitive types and object types. And all objects inherit from an object. Now, the reason on this third part we say there's no distinction between primitive types and object types, if you come from other languages and you're looking at int values or even booleans, usually they have a primitive type for that, but in Ruby, you know that you already have your true class, you have your false class, you have your integer class, your boolean class, so everything is still just an object itself. So for this slide, we're going to talk about object references. Whenever you're coding in Ruby, you're not actually making code for an object. You're actually making the code and developing the code for the object reference. And that's what it is here. So every time you're programming, you're actually using a reference of the code. You're instantiating the code, creating a constructor, and you're working with a reference of it. Especially if we're working with the built-in Ruby core. So that's why here I say this is what we work with. When we're working with the Ruby core, any of the Ruby core libraries, we're working with references because we're not creating the actual classes for this. It's already been created. We're just using those classes to do our development in our code. So what we do is we actually just do the updates, the modifications, and the creations for those references. So we have an example here. What we're going to do is first we're going to create an array.new. It's going to be stored as an array object into fruits. And you notice here what we're doing is we're creating another value called foods that equals fruits. What this does is it's gonna copy the reference to foods. So you'll notice here on the next line we do a foods.push apple. So it stores an apple into the foods array. And then you do a .push cherries, which also pushes it into that foods array. So we take a look now. We have our array here with apple and cherries. Now, if you print that array out, the food and fruits will have the same array. But what happens if you create a new array with foods, you'll notice you print foods and fruits. They're actually different references now. One's pointing to a instantiated new array object, and another one still has this apples and cherries. So let's just let's see it in action so you have a better idea. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to launch the IRB. And let's go ahead and use that first example. So we have our empty array of fruits. Now I'm going to point foods to fruits. So we have a reference. Again, empty array. Now let's go ahead and just push those elements there. Notice we're chaining the elements together, so we're actually doing two statements at once. So now you see if we do foods, there's 2 elements in the array. And we can go ahead and compare foods, fruits. And you notice they both have the same element. But if I do, on the foods, I create a new array. Now it has a different reference. So when I do the print, right there, you notice the foods is empty, and the fruit still has the 2 elements there. So this one here, the array.new, this is just the empty array, so that's what it points to now. Now, as you just saw, we created a new object, we used a constructor. That's what we're going to talk about next, is with this new method. We can create new objects, and we're working with a reference because we're not actually building the object. We're working with references every time we're programming. So here we're going to allocate memory for the new object, and then we invoke the initialize method. When you call that new, there is no new method in the class itself, so it's actually using a class called initialize. So for this myFirstClass.new, this one's actually going to look at your method initialize here. Here code, and so let's see a live example of that in action. Now this, it goes into the myFirstClass, and it gets instantiated with new, and notice that there's 0 arguments here.